What's up? It's Meredith. Welcome back to my channel. Today's video is one that I've wanted to share with you guys for a while now. I have had so many comments and questions on my sourdough recipe routine and that whole process. And although I've only been doing the whole sourdough thing for the last 3 or 4 months, I feel like I've learned a lot in that short period of time. One of those things being that there are so many different recipes and videos and people with different opinions on what you should do and what you should not do. And it just seems so overwhelming if you're wanting to get started with baking with sourdough. So I wanted to make this video to kind of show you that it is completely doable with a normal busy schedule. I'm a mom, I have 2 young kids, so our weekends are packed with birthday parties and soccer games, and we are going all the time. And I still have the time to make 2 loaves of bread every single week for my family. So this is just to share with you guys what I do personally. I know everybody has different ways of doing it. This is just a routine that works for me, and hopefully this video helps you guys if you're wanting to get started in the whole sourdough process, or maybe you just need help simplifying your process and your routine. So this is what works for me. It's become our tradition every Sunday. We have sourdough Sunday. So every Sunday morning, I have a fresh loaf of bread and we cut straight into it, straight out of the oven. And it's so freaking good. There's nothing better than like fresh bread out of the oven with a little bit of butter. Oh, so good. Those 2 loaves together last us throughout the week perfectly. And that's with all 4 of us having sourdough pretty much every single day. Before I get started, if you are new to sourdough bread has become so trendy right now, baking with sourdough, because I think people started to realize how easy it is to make a loaf of bread. All you need is flour and water. I'm not gonna go into how I made my sourdough starter in this video, but all you need is flour and water. It's super simple. I did it. I'm not a professional. I had no idea what I was doing. It took some time and persistence, but we got it and we're baking bread and it's working. So when I'm talking about sourdough starter in this video, that's all it is. It's flour and water that over time naturally ferments and makes this natural yeast. And that's what helps your bread to rise so that you don't need that prepackaged yeast. Also, because it's a naturally fermented food, it's also really great for your gut health. It lowers your glycemic index. There are just so many different health benefits for sourdough bread. So yeah, that's why it's become so trendy. That's why I started to do it. And now that I've started, I cannot stop. It becomes so addicting. But yeah, so without further ado, I'm going to jump into this video and I am going to walk you through all the way from when I pull my sourdough starter out of the fridge to when I'm baking my loaves of bread. So let's get started. The first thing I do is pull my sourdough starter out on Friday, and I typically keep mine in the microwave. I know some people like to keep theirs in the oven, but just wherever is a nice warm place, especially if you keep your house pretty cool. And I've heard way too many horror stories of people accidentally preheating their oven with their starter, so I just prefer to keep mine in the microwave. And by that night, you'll see that my starter has pretty much doubled in size, which is what you're looking for. And that's when I'm ready to go ahead and feed my starter. You feed your starter with equal parts warm filtered water and unbleached flour. And I typically just use the water from the fridge and then microwave it until it's right above room temperature. You can see my nice active bubbly starter, but it will actually be so much better after you feed it once out of the fridge. So in order to do this, we go ahead and discard the majority of our starter, which feels very wasteful, but you can use this sourdough discard is what it's called to bake other recipes with. And once you've discarded the majority of your starter and you're left with just a small amount of starter in the bottom of your jar, it's time to feed it with that warm filtered water that we microwaved a second ago and some unbleached flour. Now, as you see, I'm using a small kitchen scale, and this just really helps when baking and feeding our sourdough starter. So I kind of just eyeball it, and I fill up the filtered water at the same level as the starter. And then once I see how many grams of water I use, I try to use the same grams of flour, if that makes sense. So if I'm adding 100 grams of filtered water, I will go in and use 100, maybe a little bit more, maybe like 110 grams of flour, just to really help thicken and strengthen that sourdough starter in order to bake with. You can really use any type of flour. I know a lot of people like to use whole wheat flour or rye flour in order to strengthen your sourdough starter, but I've always only used unbleached all-purpose flour, and it's worked just fine. And you mix that all up until it's this nice thick pancake batter consistency, and it is ready to cover up and set back in the microwave so it can rise overnight. And you can use anything to mark the level of your sourdough. Right now, I was just using one of the kids' magic markers because it's what I had. And once you cover it with a lid that is not airtight, you should be able to see the next morning that the level of your sourdough starter has doubled in size. Now, when I checked on my starter the following morning, it had not quite doubled in size yet, but it was still very active, and I did not have the time to wait around to make my dough. So I just went for it, and I've come to find out that sourdough is a lot more forgiving than people let on. It's not complicated. So I went ahead and started making my dough. So I use my small kitchen scale and a large glass mixing bowl, and I use 200 grams of starter. Keep in mind that this recipe makes 2 loaves, so if you want to make only 1 loaf, just cut everything in half in this recipe. If you get a little bit more than 200 grams, it's totally fine. And then I try to add about 650 grams of water. I accidentally added a little bit more than that. And I accidentally did not record this part, but once you've added your warm filtered water, you want to mix the water and the starter together until it's this nice, smooth, milky consistency. And then you're ready to add your unbleached bread flour. I use about 1,000 grams of this bread flour. And again, this makes 2 loaves. And it also doesn't really matter if you go a little bit over. I feel like I always do, and that is totally fine. Next, you want to add about 20 grams of salt. And some people say that you should wait until you've made your dough initially and add your salt later, but I've tried it both ways and it doesn't really seem to make a difference. So I go ahead and add my salt when I add my flour. And then you'll see that what I'm using to mix the dough, this is called a dough whisk, and it is absolutely not essential to make sourdough bread. There are all kinds of cool little kitchen gadgets that people use to make sourdough, and they are not required. I did not start out using this. I used a wooden spoon initially to mix the dough. And then once you get it to a certain point anyway, you'll want to go in with your hands to really make sure that the dough is good and combined. And don't worry if your dough is super sticky. That is completely normal at this stage in the process. So go ahead and rinse those hands, cover up your dough, and you're going to leave that to rest for about 30 minutes. And while that's resting, I'm going to go ahead and feed my sourdough starter one last time, just like I did before, until it's that nice thick pancake batter consistency, and that is good to cover. And then in a couple hours, I'm going to set it in the fridge, and it will be good to sit in there for the rest of the week. Now, after that 30 minutes is up, it is time to do your first set of stretch and folds. You're going to end up doing about 4 total. And as you'll see, I have this bowl of water set aside, and that is to help the dough from sticking to your hands as badly, because again, at this stage, the dough is going to be very sticky, and that's totally normal. So you can use flour or water, but I prefer to use water because if you add too much flour into your dough, it will end up very dry. As you can see, these stretch and folds are pretty simple. You literally just stretch your dough out and then fold it over, and you work your way around the mold with this same process. And after about 4 of those stretch and folds, you'll notice that the dough doesn't stretch quite as much, which is exactly what you want. And once you've gotten it to that point, you can go ahead and cover it up and leave it for another 30 minutes until the next set of stretch and folds. And as you can see, I used that 30 minutes to get ready for my son's soccer game because, again, this routine is one that can work into your normal busy schedule, which is so nice. So we have got to get these stretch and folds done so we can get going to my son's soccer game on this morning. I'll also say that there have been times where my schedule just did not allow 4 sets of stretch and folds, and that is a-okay. I've done only 2 sets of stretch and folds, and it's turned out perfectly fine. So if you do 1 more set of stretch and folds, if you feel like it needs it, or if you do 1 less, it's really not going to make that big of a difference. Just do the best you can with the time that you have. And by the last set of stretch and folds, you'll notice that the consistency of the dough is a lot smoother, and it's also just a lot stronger and a lot easier to work with. So by that last set of stretch and folds, your dough is ready to cover and start that bulk fermentation process, which basically means that it will rise to about double its size, and you'll see that the top will get really bubbly, and that means that it is ready to start the pre-shaping process. This can take different amounts of time, just kind of depending on your starter and the different conditions of your home. But once you've gotten to that point where it's about doubled in size and nice and bubbly on top and not as sticky, then you are ready to start pre-shaping your dough. So for shaping your dough, you're gonna either need some banneton baskets like what I have, or you can simply just use 2 mixing bowls lined with a kitchen towel. Either will work just as well. And then you're going to sprinkle some flour on the inside of your baskets or bowls. And this will really just help keep the dough from sticking once you've shaped it. Most people say to use rice flour for this, but I refuse to buy more than 2 different types of flour for my bread. So I've always just used all-purpose flour, and it's worked just fine. Once you have your banneton baskets or bowls prepared with the flour, you're going to go ahead and dump all of your dough out onto the countertop so you can shape it. And it is totally fine if you need to use a little bit of water to keep the dough from sticking to your hands still. That's totally normal. It's totally fine. And because I'm making 2 different loaves of bread with this dough, I'm going to go ahead and separate it into 2 equal parts. You don't need to measure it or weigh it. I just kind of eyeball it. And I'm using this little handy dandy tool to separate the dough into 2 parts. But before I even had one of these, I just used a flat spatula and it works just as well. So again, no need to buy all the fancy gadgets to get started on your sourdough journey. Now, once I have the dough separated into those 2 equal parts, then the pre-shaping process begins. So as you'll see, I'm going to start by stretching out my dough pretty thin until it makes this nice like rectangle-ish shape. And then you're going to fold the dough over one side over towards the middle and then the other side. And then you're going to start from one end and roll it up into a nice little ball. And then you do this push and pull motion, and this really just helps to build the tension in the dough so that it holds that shape better. Once you have it into a nice tight little ball, you put it into your banneton basket or your bowl, and you're going to cover that for about 25 minutes. And then I'll repeat the same process to form my other loaf of bread. And once that 25 minutes is up, you're going to repeat the exact same process again. And this might seem a little bit redundant and not necessary, but this really does help strengthen your dough and helps it keep that shape even better. And you'll notice when I try to stretch out my dough this second time around, it's not going to want to stretch as much. And that's because it's really starting to hold that tension and hold that shape, which is exactly what you're looking for at this stage. And keep in mind when you're shaping your dough the second time, this is the final shaping. So you really want it to hold that shape really well and make sure that it looks exactly the way you want it to, basically. And then you're going to set it back into your basket. Make sure and give it another little sprinkle of flour. I always forget to do this. And then cover it up with a damp kitchen towel this time. And then you're going to actually set these in the fridge. And you can set these in there for 1 hour and up to 24 hours. Some people say they can sit longer in that cold fermentation process, but I've never personally gone longer than 24 hours. The longer that they sit in that cold fermentation, the more sour that the dough will taste. So that night, I go ahead and preheat my oven to 500 degrees Fahrenheit with my Dutch oven already in the oven. And I am going to go ahead and bake one of my loaves of bread on Saturday night. That's just, again, kind of what's worked best into my schedule on the weekends. So once that oven is preheating with the Dutch oven inside, you're going to lay out a sheet of parchment paper, and this is what your dough is going to be laid out on. And as you can see, it's really held its shape nicely in my little Banneton basket during its cold fermentation process. So we did a good job shaping this loaf of bread. So once it's set out on the parchment paper, you're gonna go ahead and sprinkle some more flour and just kind of rub that over the top and get rid of any excess flour. Dust that off of the parchment paper as well. And this really just helps to see the design if you want to score all the pretty fancy designs into your sourdough bread, which is 100% not necessary, but it's part of the fun for me. I always like doing the fun little designs. And once you have scored your dough and your oven is preheated, you can go ahead and set your dough down into your Dutch oven, cover it back up and set it back into the oven. And once you've done that, you're going to turn the temperature down to 450 degrees Fahrenheit, and you're going to set that in the oven for 25 minutes. After that 25 minutes is up, you're going to take the lid off of your Dutch oven and bake for another 25 minutes. And this is what the final result looked like. It got a pretty decent rise. I was pretty happy with it. It's probably not the best loaf I've ever made, but it's definitely not the worst. And that's all just the fun of the sourdough process. Sometimes they turn out great and sometimes they don't. And sometimes you won't even know what you did right and what you did wrong. And that is a-okay. Just keep going with it and you're going to have some amazing bread. We baked the other loaf on Sunday morning like we always do, and it was absolutely delicious. We ate so much of it between the 4 of us that this was all that was left of that loaf of bread. So luckily I had that second loaf ready to go for this coming week. And I hope that this video helps you get started on your sourdough journey or helped answer any questions that you might have. If you have any other questions, please leave them in the comments down below. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And if you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to see more, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.